All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the latest iteration of our Florida Talks at Home series. This is a special series of panels that we have put together on the long history of race relations in Florida. My name is Keith Simmons. I'm the Communications Director at Florida Humanities, and I'm going to give a quick introduction for tonight's program before turning it over to Steve Seibert, who's going to also provide an introduction for our moderator and our panelists. The long history of race relations is a series of discussions convened by Dr. David Jackson, a professor of history at FAMU and a member of the board of directors for Florida Humanities, and Steve Seibert, former executive director of Florida Humanities. The goal of this series is to convey stories about Florida's Black history, spanning from European settlement in the 16th century to the present. These conversations are essential to have in our present moment, and we are proud to work with prominent scholars across the country to make this possible. We also understand that these conversations can inspire a lot of passion. Florida Humanities does not endorse any of the comments made by presenters or attendees. Indeed, our objective is to facilitate a lively, authentic, and enlightening discussion on these topics. To that end, our presenters will keep the remarks brief, and then we'll open up the program to questions. Members of our audience will have an opportunity to ask those questions. You use the chat function here in our box to ask those questions, and we're going to do our best to work all of your questions into our conversation this evening. And at the end of tonight's presentation, you will receive a short feedback survey in your email, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would take the time to fill it out. We also hope that you'll be able to join us for the next conversation in this series. It'll be the third one. It's called I Am a Man, The Struggle for Civil Rights in Florida. That program will take place on Monday, November 2nd at 5 p.m. You can register for that by visiting floridahumanities.org/events to learn more. Your support, by the way, is essential to helping to sustain these programs. If you enjoy tonight's program, we ask that you consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support to contribute to our organization and continue to make these programs possible. I will now turn the program over to Steve Seibert, one of our co-moderators for today's discussion, and again, the former executive director for Florida Humanities.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. So, ladies and gentlemen, this summer, the Florida Humanities Board declared this. They said, "It is our obligation to use the humanities to understand racism and injustice and how to curb their influence in society." So to that end, our board member, Dr. David Jackson, offered to moderate this series as Mr. Simmons just described. And our hope is to deepen our collective understanding of race and history and culture and law so that we can more honestly and more empathetically tackle the issues of this day. With that, let me introduce our friend and colleague, Dr. David Jackson, Jr. He is the Associate Provost for Graduate Education and Dean of the Graduate College at Florida A&M University. He has been in the History Department at FAMU since 1997 and a professor there since 2004. He received his PhD, earned his PhD in history from the University of Memphis. He holds a master's in public administration from Florida A&M and an undergraduate degree in history education, magna cum laude, also from Florida A&M. There are at least five books to his credit. He has won every award and honor that you can possibly imagine. He's been Teacher of the Year, Advanced Teacher of the Year again. Who's who among America's teachers. He sits on the Florida Humanities Board. He sits on the Florida Historical Society Board. He's been a member of the board of the Center for Global Security and International Affairs, the University Press of Florida. He's been an editorial advisory board member for that, and he has sat on the Florida Historical Commission. He is an iconic figure in education in Florida. He is a fine man, and maybe most importantly, he is a proud alumni of the Marching 100. Dr. Jackson, thank you for leading this effort, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Steve, for an outstanding introduction. You were too kind. You have me smiling over here, especially with your reference to the Marching 100, because I am a proud member of FAMU's famous, incomparable Marching 100. So I want to thank you also, Steve, for helping to push this idea in light of some of the things that were taking place in the country earlier. And you saw fit and saw the need for us to, as a board, to kind of address these matters head on and to try and make a difference. So we appreciate you for what you've done to contribute to this program. Let me begin by introducing the panelists this afternoon. We have Dr. Will Guzman, who is a former colleague of mine. Dr. Guzman is a graduate of Florida A&M University. He also graduated from Florida State University, where he earned a master's degree. His undergrad was in African American Studies from FAMU. He earned a master's from Florida State in social science education, and then a PhD from the University of Texas at El Paso. Dr. Guzman worked at Florida A&M University as my colleague in the history department for a number of years. Then he left and worked at New Jersey City University. Currently, he's a professor of history at Prairie View A&M University. So we're happy to have Dr. Guzman with us, an award-winning author, and we are very happy to have him and that he agreed to serve on this panel this afternoon and make a presentation. We also have with us our esteemed colleague, Dr. Tameka Hobbs, who is also a graduate of Florida A&M University. She earned a bachelor's degree from FAMU in history as well. And then she went on to Florida State and earned a master's and PhD in history. Dr. Hobbs, too, worked with us at Florida A&M University before leaving to work at Virginia State University. And then she worked at Florida Memorial University. She had a stint at Valdosta State University. Now she's back at Florida Memorial as Associate Provost for Academic Affairs and a professor in the history department as well. And Dr. Hobbs is also an award-winning author who has written on racial relations in the state of Florida. So we are very honored to have her with us this afternoon as well. And so the way we have this laid out is that I will begin with a general overview because this is my area as well. And so I'm going to do a presentation, and I'll be followed by Dr. Guzman and then Dr. Hobbs, and then we will transition into questions and answers. So without further ado, let me hop right in so we won't waste any time. When most people think of Florida, they think of this rich ethnic diversity. They think of Disneyland. They think of the nice beaches that we have in the state of Florida, but seldom do they view this state as sharing many of the characteristics of other Deep South states in terms of race. Florida continually tries to paint itself as being exceptional from the rest of the South. Consequently, historians have not traditionally given it the same kind of scrutiny as other Southern states. Florida has a very large mixture of ethnic groups, but historically, when it comes to race relations, white Floridians basically carried the same basic attitudes and assumptions of superiority as whites in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and other parts of the South. In fact, like most states in the Deep South throughout the 20th century, Florida had its share of lynchings and mob violence. There were black codes in Florida, residential segregation, discrimination, civil rights violations, and even the total destruction of one of its progressive all-black towns called Rosewood. So despite the perception to the contrary, in many respects, race relations in Florida were worse than in other Southern states. Florida basically mirrored other Southern states or exceeded them in cruelty and how it treated its black citizens throughout the first half of the 20th century. As you all will see, several southern cities became infamous for one sensational crime against or discriminatory treatment of African Americans. However, this presentation examines race relations in Florida in the early 20th century by juxtaposing major patterns of white mistreatment of Blacks, primarily throughout the South, against similar examples in Florida. So if Oklahoma had its Greenwood, Florida had its Rosewood. If Alabama had its Scottsboro, Florida had its Groveland. If Georgia had its Sam Hoes, Florida had its Claude Neal. If Mississippi had its Medgar Evers, Florida had its Harry T. Moore. And if North Carolina had Black college student activism in Greensboro, Florida had Black college student activism in Tallahassee. So Black Floridians suffered because of their race, just like any other Black people living in the South. Living in Florida did not preclude them from this type of suffering. And so ultimately, when we look at Florida, we must properly place the state alongside of the traditions, values, and mores that governed the South and victimized African Americans in large measure. Through examining Florida's racial history, we may begin to view Florida as one of the South's best kept secrets. And so let me just share before I move on that I have a few slides that may be graphic. And so I just want to issue that warning in advance. In 1921, up until 1921, African Americans in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma were prospering economically and otherwise. They had many successful businesses, that so many, in fact, that they created what was called Black Wall Street. Unfortunately, whites in Tulsa resented Blacks' independence and viewed progressive African Americans as setting a terrible example for other Blacks. This culminated into a riot that left hundreds, if not thousands, of Black people victimized, robbed, beaten, killed, and exiled. This became one of the worst riots to erupt in the country, and certainly in Oklahoma. In this case, Sarah Page accused Dick Rowland, a Black man, of trying to assault her on an elevator. After his arrest, talk began to spread that angry whites were going to lynch him. When Blacks went to the jail to protect Dick Rowland, words were exchanged and the shot rang out. This began what some scholars considered to be the single bloodiest episode of racial violence in American history. The National Guard would ultimately be called in, and they incarcerated the African-American residents of Greenwood at a nearby baseball stadium, while whites ravaged their homes, looted their goods, and set fire to their homes, businesses, and churches. While one may not find it altogether surprising for such an incident to occur in Oklahoma, one may be struck by the fact that a similar riot occurred in Florida. In 1923, just 2 years later, the town of Rosewood experienced an identical fate as Greenwood for almost identical reasons: white fears and resentment of Black progress. Rosewood, located in Levy County about 9 miles east of the Gulf of Mexico, flourished as a small all-Black town with about 350 residents in 1920. Most of the family members in the town owned their own 2-story homes and property. For example, James and Emma Carey, members of the most prominent family in Rosewood, owned a well-furnished 2-story home, which even had an organ. The townsmen boasted of having at least 3 churches, a school, a Masonic hall, and they even had a successful baseball team that competed against Black and white competitors. These signs of Black progress served as a constant irritant to whites in surrounding towns and threatened their way of life. So on January 1st, 1923, a white mob began looking for Jesse Hunter, an African-American male who had allegedly attacked Fannie Taylor, a white female in nearby Sumner. Taylor set in motion a series of events that ultimately led to the complete destruction of the all-Black Rosewood. While there is no doubt that Taylor was attacked, from the beginning, Black eyewitnesses who worked as laundresses for the Taylors identified John Bradley, with whom Fannie Taylor had been having an affair, as being her attacker. They actually saw him visit her home immediately before the attack when her husband was away at work. Unfortunately, Their version of the story fell on deaf ears. At least 8 people were killed in Rosewood over the next few days, and a number of others were injured. The unrepentant mob returned to the town after most of the Black residents had fled seeking safety and set it on fire. They wanted to totally erase this ostentatious example of Black progress and independence. And we will talk a little bit later about the survivors of Rosewood and the memorial that has been placed in that area today. One of the most tragic reminders of the plight of African Americans manifested itself through the scores of Blacks who became victims of lynch mobs throughout the South. Many times African Americans were killed for being assertive, for getting out of their quote unquote place, or just to send a message to the larger community to stay in its quote unquote place. Most times state and federal authorities did absolutely nothing to deter these types of crimes or bring the perpetrators to justice. In Coweta County, Georgia, on the eve of the new century, Sam Hose, a Black laborer, became embroiled in an argument with his employer, Alfred Cranford, after Hose asked for a pay advance and the permission to leave work to visit his ill mother. When Cranford refused to accommodate Hose's request, an argument ensued. The next day, Cranford found Hose only to resume the argument and eventually pulled out his gun on Hose as he chopped wood in the back of Cranford's house. When Cranford threatened to shoot Hose, the latter took the axe he was using and threw it at Cranford, striking him in the head, instantly killing him. Afraid, Hose ran away to his mother's cabin. By the time the newspapers finished embellishing the story, Hose supposedly had jumped Cranford as he ate dinner and killed him. Then, according to these papers, this quote unquote Black beast rapist dragged Cranford's wife into the room alongside of the corpse and began to rape her repeatedly, giving her syphilis. Stories like this one fed the sadistic minds of vigilantes who felt that to keep social order, they had to protect white women at all costs. While in reality, Hose never touched Cranford's wife, newspaper reporters knew what it took to inflame the white public and bring out the worst in them. For many, this ordeal became more of an issue of protecting white womanhood than it did of avenging Cranford's death. After Hose's capture, news of his lynching was publicized to such a degree that at least 2,000 men, women, and children watched or participated in this affair. The mob took off Hose's clothes and chained him to a tree. They then stacked wood that had been soaked in kerosene around him. And before saturating Hose with oil and applying the torch, they cut off his ears, fingers, and genitals and skinned his face. While some in the crowd plunged knives into the victim's flesh, others later watched as the flesh from Hose's body burned off of his bones. And even before his body had time to cool, his heart and liver were removed and cut into several pieces, and his bones were crushed into small particles and then sold for 10 to 25 cents a piece. While this may be one of the most despicable tragedies to occur in Georgia, similar lynchings took place in Florida. In fact, in 1920, Florida had 11 lynchings, the most in the nation. Between 1882 and 1930, African Americans were more likely to be lynched in Florida than any other southern state. And for every 100,000 Black people in Florida, 79.8 were lynched during this time span. And Mississippi, with this infamous reputation, Mississippi followed Florida with a relatively distant figure of 52.8 per 100,000. In 1934, some 35 years after Sam Hose's murder in Georgia, Jackson County Floridians carried out a lynching that had more than 2 times the number of people that participated in Hose's lynching, and it turned out to be just as brutal. On October 19, 1934, searchers found 19-year-old Lola Kennedy's mutilated body not far from her house. Claude Neal, a young Black man, was arrested and charged with her murder, although no hard evidence existed against him. Later, a mob formed and extricated Neal from jail and then took him to a holding location. They advertised the coming of his murder in the newspapers and made sure travelers from outside and inside of the state had time enough to arrive. People from as many as 11 states were in attendance at this lynching. The mob awaiting Neal grew so large that the men detaining him decided that it would be safer for them to carry out the lynching. And so they tied a rope around Neal's neck and hung him from a tree. Shortly afterwards, they cut off his penis and made him eat it. Then they cut off his testicles and made him eat them and say he liked it. They sliced his stomach and sides with knives and burned him from head to toe. And as soon as he would almost choke to death from hanging, he would be let down and the torture would start all over again. After Neal died, the mobsters tied his corpse to one of their vehicles and dragged it to the Kennedy house where thousands had gathered. Several people drove knives into the corpse while George Kennedy, Lola's father, fired 3 bullets into Neal's forehead with the .45. Other people kicked the corpse while still others drove their cars back and forth over it. Mob members even took Neal's fingers and toes as souvenirs and finally hung his corpse on a tree in front of the Marianna courthouse. Still not totally satisfied, mob members then attacked the Black community where Neal lived, burning every shack they could find. No one went to jail for this horrendous murder, and the coroners determined that even with photos and other potential evidence, that these lynching victims died at the hands of persons unknown. Events of this nature were constant reminders to African Americans that they were always in a precarious situation as long as they were in close proximity to whites in the South, even in Florida. In 1931, Alabama received national attention for the so-called Scottsboro trial. 9 young Black boys were charged with raping 2 white women on a freight train on totally specious charges. They were jailed in Scottsboro, Alabama, given a semblance of a trial, and sentenced to death with the long exception of the youngest defendant, a 13-year-old, given a life sentence. Fortunately, lawyers for the Communist Party's International Labor Defense intervened on behalf of the young men. Appealing the verdict all the way to the Supreme Court, they concluded that the men did not have adequate legal counsel and ordered a new trial. The next trial ended pretty much the same as the first one, with the defendants either receiving death sentences or life in prison. By May of 1950, after another appeal and after Ruby Bates, one of the white women who was supposedly raped, admitted that the charges were a hoax, state prosecutors dropped the charges against the young men, and the last of them were released from prison. While the Scottsboro case received national attention, so did a very similar case in Groveland, Florida. However, the Groveland case had a more dismal ending. In Groveland, 4 Black men, Sammy Shepard, Walter Irvin, Ernest Thomas, and 16-year-old Charles Greenlee, were charged with kidnapping and raping 17-year-old Norma Paget and assaulting her husband, Willie Paget, on July 16, 1949. Ernest Thomas understood the apparent danger of this charge, so he ran away and eluded the police for a week before being shot and killed by sheriffs about 200 miles away from Groveland. The other 3 men were arrested, beaten, tortured, and made to confess. It remained doubtful if anyone ever raped Norma Paget, and the defendants later told NAACP counsel that their confessions had been coerced. Norma's husband had beaten her on a previous occasion and had been warned never to do it again by his in-laws. Thus, Willie and Norma may have concocted this story only to hide another beating. Whatever the reason, when the case went to trial, it took the all-white jury only 90 minutes to return guilty verdicts. Similar to the Scottsboro case, Irvin and Shepard were sentenced to death, while Greenlee, the youngest of the group, received leniency. The defendants appealed their case to the Florida Supreme Court, but they refused to overturn it. However, the U.S. Supreme Court later unanimously overturned the convictions of both Shepard and Irving. So by November 1951, prosecutors decided to retry the case, and the sheriff, Willis McCall, went to the Rayford State Prison to transfer the men to Tavares, Florida for another pretrial hearing. Carrying the men in this patrol car, McCall later claimed that on the way, one of the men had to urinate, and also that his front right tire began to go flat and needed to be changed. After he stopped, McCall alleged that the men tried to attack him, so he shot and killed both of them. As you can see in the picture, he's standing over the bodies on the right-hand side. Sheriff McCall did not realize that Irvin did not die from the gunshots and only pretended to be dead. After surviving the attempted murder, Irvin later reported that Sheriff McCall and his deputy, James L. Yates, intentionally tried to kill both of them without provocation. Although news of this kind of injustice against blacks reflected unfavorably upon the nation during the Cold War, only a change in governors in Florida saved Irving from execution. Leroy Collins, the new governor, changed his sentence to life imprisonment, stating that not enough conclusive evidence existed to put Irving to death. Of course, this chagrined white Lake County residents. In many ways, this case mirrored the Scottsboro trial. In both instances, the men were charged with assaulting white women on very frivolous evidence. Second, Southern white men clearly were preoccupied with the desire to protect and preserve white womanhood. And third, both cases raised serious questions about the fairness of the American judicial system. Florida civil rights activist Harriett T. Moore had to operate in this kind of environment. Many individuals stand out from the civil rights era in this nation. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X are two well-known leaders, but there were many others, and most states had one individual that they could identify as their most outspoken proponent for black rights at different times during the movement. In Mississippi, Medgar Evers filled this role for years. As field secretary for the NAACP's Mississippi chapter, Evers led a number of efforts from Jackson, Mississippi, to have the University of Mississippi integrated and increase black voter registrations, which led to a number of street demonstrations. Many white Southerners resented his tenacity, and some even threatened to take his life. These threats became a reality on June 12, 1963, when white supremacist Baron de la Beckwith gunned down Medgar Evers as he exited his car to go into his house. His wife and children witnessed this horrible murder, and news of which would reverberate throughout the country. While Evers' murder gained national attention, and the guys on the right-hand side are the jurors, the all-white male jurors who decided not to convict Baron de la Beckwith. But while Evers' murder gained national attention, other outspoken civil rights activists also had been murdered. Some 12 years earlier, the most prominent civil rights activist in Florida lost his life when extremists bombed his home. Very early, Harriett T. Moore, Mims, Florida, became a well-respected leader in the black community in South Florida and Brevard County as a teacher and principal. As an activist, he challenged the discriminatory wages paid to black teachers in the state and focused on voting and the violence committed against blacks in the Sunshine State. Moore helped to establish the first statewide conference of the NAACP and became president of its Florida branch. He later served as the executive director for Florida's NAACP, a paid full-time position. In 1945, he formed the Progressive Voters League in Florida, which significantly increased the number of black registered voters in the state. These deeds were not without consequences, as Moore and his wife Harriett both suffered severely. They were both fired from their teaching positions in Mims, for example. Perhaps more than anything else, Moore's advocacy for the black defendants in the Groveland rape case cost him his life. When the three young men were arrested and the fourth was shot, Moore became an outspoken advocate for them. He helped raise money for defense attorneys, campaigned throughout the state on behalf of the men, wrote letters to public officials, and even encouraged the NAACP to provide financial and legal assistance for the defendants. Some whites resented his efforts so much that they bombed his home on Christmas night of 1951, killing Moore and his wife. The powerful explosion nearly demolished his entire frame-structured home, and it is believed that Orange County members of the Ku Klux Klan were responsible for his death. Although no one was ever charged for the murder, one historian has written that Harriett T. Moore became the first civil rights leader assassinated in the United States. Like other states throughout the South, African Americans were denied their civil rights in the Sunshine States. Consequently, Florida became the leader for salient student activism during the civil rights movement, a fact often overlooked by historians. Most point to North Carolina A&T at Greensboro as the origin of organized student involvement in the movement. On February 1st, 1964, college students from A&T, David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezel Blair Jr., and Joe McNeil sat down at a segregated Lynch County in a Woolworth store and were refused service. They kept their seats, but were still given no service. They returned to the store day after day, and as other students heard about the Greensboro demonstrations, they decided to stage sit-ins of their own. 6 months later, blacks in Greensboro were being served at the same lunch counters as whites. About 4 years later, 4 years before the sit-ins in Greensboro, however, Florida A&M University students had begun an organized and successful bus boycott. On May 27, 1956, two FAMU students, Wilhelmina Jakes of West Palm Beach and Carrie Patterson of Lakeland, boarded a Tallahassee city bus and sat next to a white woman. For breaching the code of racial etiquette, they were arrested and charged with inciting a riot. That same night, a cross was burned in front of their rooming house. The next day, FAMU students held a mass meeting and agreed to refrain from riding the city buses. Later joined by other Tallahassee community leaders and students, this boycott lasted for 7 months and severely impacted the city's bus revenues. In fact, the bus line was closed down several times because African Americans made up about 95% of all bus riders. These factors eventually caused the bus line to adopt a more progressive seating policy for all of its customers. So, and then less than 2 years later is when the students at North Carolina A&T began their sit-ins. So in conclusion, let me say that in some ways, Florida has been at the forefront of racial change in America. However, she has shown that she is characteristically Southern in dealing with African Americans. Mob violence, Klan bombings, lynchings, racial injustice, discrimination, segregation, and any host of other variables were an everyday part of the Black experience in Florida in the early 20th century. African Americans in Florida struggled against the same forces as Blacks in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the rest of the South. No longer can Florida hide its common identity with these states behind the curtain of ethnic diversity, Disneyland, and beaches. For Florida has proven throughout most of the 20th century that Blacks in the Sunshine State would not be treated equally as whites. Ultimately, conditions for African Americans in Florida on many levels were worse than in other Southern states in terms of race relations. And the final thought that I would like to leave you all with comes from the late Dr. John Hope Franklin, who was one of America's most celebrated historians. And this is a quote from Dr. Franklin. He said that the places that commemorate sad history are not places in which we wallow or walled in remorse, but instead places in which we may be moved to a new resolve to be better citizens. Explaining history from a variety of angles makes it not only more interesting, but more true. And when it is more true, more people come to feel that they have a part in it. That is where patriotism and loyalty intersect with truth. Thank you. Next, we will have a presentation by Dr. Will Guzman, who will cover a portion of Reconstruction into the early 20th century. Dr. Guzman.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I'm going to do the screen share so we could run a PowerPoint. If you could grant me permission to do that. Okay, I have it now. As Dr. Jackson has mentioned, Florida has had a long storied record of racially charged violence against African Americans that dates back to the antebellum period. One of the worst was the malice experienced in Jackson County between 1869 and 1871. This 3-year period of heightened tension was arguably the worst racial violence in the state's history, which saw an estimated hundreds of Blacks killed. On the low end, about 71 African Americans were murdered, but on the high end of estimates, well over 180 Black people were killed, and some whites. The county seat of Jackson County is Marianna. Jackson County was named after Andrew Jackson. He was Florida's first territorial governor and is known to have been, quote, a slave owner and Indian killer, unquote. Jackson would go on to become a 2-term president of the United States. Most whites in Florida, particularly in Jackson County, were no different than their fellow Southern and Northern counterparts. What made Jackson County whites unique was the degree and extent of their behavior. After the Civil War, paramilitary units, vigilante groups such as the KKK, Pale Faces, and lynch mobs all combined to resist change in race relations. The Klan resorted to the wholesale lynching of Blacks, and from 1868 to 1871, there were over 400 Klan lynchings in the United States. Between the years of 1869 and 1871, Jackson County witnessed much pandemonium in the wake of social political changes brought about by the Republicans through vis-a-vis Reconstruction. These changes were far-reaching. They threatened white power, frightened Black livelihood, and jeopardized the already delicate relations between the two. Of the conflicts between the races, what happened in Jackson County, which has been dubbed by historians the War of Jackson County, was extremely intense and startling. What's significant, of course, is that it hushed the newly received potential social, political, and economic voices of African Americans in this rural county against centuries-old oppression experienced by them and their ancestors at the hands of the white power structure. After the Civil War, the Black population in Jackson County was in the majority. In other words, Jackson County was part of Northern Florida's Black Belt. Some factors that may have led to this include many white men in the county losing their lives fighting for the losing cause, the Confederacy. Economic conditions were such that forced some whites to move northward and westward. In addition, other whites were so distressed by the loss of their African captives or enslaved population after the Civil War, coupled with rule by Northern carpetbaggers and Freedmen Bureau agents and their former African captives, as well as scalawags, that they decided not to remain in the United States. So many whites in Florida were leaving that an organization was established to assist them. The Florida Immigration Society was established specifically to organize funds and provide arrangements for white Floridians to move to Brazil. A small percentage of Jackson County residents took advantage of this offer in April of 1867. Clearly, this newly received political authority held by Blacks during Reconstruction did not go over well with Jackson County whites. The purpose of Reconstruction, of course, was to establish public schools, ensure equal citizenship for Blacks, and to try to revitalize the devastated Southern economy. One of the organs that was used to help accomplish some of these goals, of course, was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau. Most Americans held false notions that the Bureau was established strictly to assist African Americans. Although it did provide some relief to African Americans, quote, the Bureau did frequently cooperate with the planter class in enforcing the freedmen to work at low wages, unquote. In fact, the Bureau literally forced many Blacks to work for their former enslavers. And the contracts approved by the agents often specified inadequate payments to the workers. Bureau agents not only approved contracts stipulating low wages, but also tolerated contracts worded in such a manner that in the event of a poor harvest, that Black people would get nothing. Some Bureau agents in Jackson County, Florida, charged fees for drawing up labor contracts up until a War Department order in February of 1867 forbid such charges. Jackson County's large landowners feared relief programs such as the Freedmen's Bureau might undermine their social, economic, and political power because of the perceived threat to their ability to set wages scales and control attitudes towards work. The economic decline in Jackson County meant great financial loss in farm revenues, foreclosures, very large numbers of rural unemployment. The economic depressed economy, social low numbers of whites, and political loss of the war or the so-called Republican takeover, these conditions added to the perception that Blacks, coupled with the thought process of whites, were the right ingredients to spark the powder keg in the form of massive upheaval in the county. Charles H. Pierce, an African-American state senator at this time, offered a haunting description of the frightening environment as, quote, a place where Satan has his seal. He reigns in Jackson County, unquote. In other words, what he was describing, of course, was the racial terror that Blacks were experiencing in Jackson County at the hands of whites. What made Jackson County unique were primarily three factors. First, although the county was politically conservative before the Civil War, it did not wholeheartedly support secession, and some within the county would have their loyalty to the Confederacy questioned during and after the war. Second, the leadership void created by the Civil War would be filled by younger merchants and younger lawyers who quickly dismissed the old planter elite's suggestions for moderation, patience, and nonviolence, replacing them instead with an attitude that was uncompromising, ultra-conservative, and violent. Third, the impact of the 1864 Battle of Marianna served as a psychological blow to an already war-weary populace. No other county in Florida experienced the same amount of civilian casualties, along with the mental and economic devastation of prisoners of war returning from northern war camps. These factors contributed to deep-seated animosity and hatred that would result in a climate of fear towards African Americans and Republicans in Jackson County. Unfortunately, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, which was designed to protect Southern Blacks from the abuses of terrorist organizations such as the KKK previously mentioned, this act would arrive too late and too ineffective. Thousands of African Americans were murdered by whites between 1865 and 1868 in such cities such as Memphis, Tennessee, Shreveport, Louisiana, and as well as New Orleans, also in Louisiana. The terrible events in Jackson County ultimately drove out moderate African Americans, including its most famous son, as you see now on the screen, T. Thomas Fortune, and whites alike from the county, thus depriving the remaining citizens and local government of an opportunity to exercise democracy in all its diverse forms for decades. T. Thomas Fortune, of course, would go on to become a very prominent civil rights leader in his own right. After fleeing with his father as a young boy from Jackson County and Marianna and Jackson County, ultimately they would reside in Jacksonville. And as he got older, he would eventually move up north. He would become a prominent journalist, editor for a variety of prominent publications, including, of course, Marcus Garvey's The Negro World. Garvey, of course, was the leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. In the state of Florida, they would have about 2 or 3 chapters of the UNIA, including in Jacksonville and Miami, as well as Key West. Nevertheless, I think it's only fitting for me to give this quote to end this section of my presentation by T. Thomas Fortune. He says in his book, White and Black, published in the 1880s, he says, the white men of the South, the capitalists, the land sharks, the poor white trash, and the nondescripts, with 1,000 years of Christian civilization and culture behind them. These white scamps who had imposed upon the world that they were the paragons of virtue and the heaven-sent vice regents of civil power organized themselves into a band of outlaws, whose chain of auxiliaries ran throughout the entire South and deliberately proceeded to murder innocent men and women for political reasons, and to systematically rob them of their honest labor because they were too lazy to labor themselves, unquote. Now, I think this quote is fitting for a variety of reasons, because Fortune, of course, had personally experienced the terror that his father had lived under while in Jackson County. While he himself, T. Thomas Fortune, lived in Jackson County, he had began to learn the journalist trade, and thus had documented some of these sentiments of not only his own family, but others. Nevertheless, this violence in Florida, unfortunately, is not unique. In this particular example, obviously, it was politically motivated as an outgrowth due to the outlays of the Civil War and all the other events of the Reconstruction era. Now, this next incident that I'll describe, of course, was the Ocoee Massacre of November 3rd, 1920. And in just a few days next week, Tuesday, November 3rd, we'll be commemorating 100 years of this massacre. This massacre, of course, was also politically motivated. Julius July Prairie was a prominent African-American of the city of Ocoee. He had moved to Ocoee about 3 decades earlier in the 1890s from South Carolina. A very good friend of his, Mose Norman, had also moved from South Carolina. And so they were attempting to kind of create a successful life for themselves. They saw Florida as a very promising state for African Americans to engage in the new economic order. By 1920, there were a variety of factors that would influence the political climate. One of those factors, of course, included, as I mentioned previously, the rise of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. This would contribute to many African Americans having a new attitude towards the racial climate in the United States. So new, as a matter of fact, that many would dub these African Americans the new Negro. This attitude of standing up to not only white supremacy, domination, control, but also becoming more politically engaged, as well as affirming their cultural roots, including looking into their African roots and at the base, as a base for cultural affirmation. The New Negro movement, of course, would spawn what we commonly know as the Harlem Renaissance. And that becomes important because oftentimes when people think of the Harlem Renaissance, they think of it as just a movement that was specific to the New York City area, when in reality, it was not only a national phenomenon, but a global phenomenon that would impact the African diaspora. Nevertheless, the rise of the UNIA is important to keep in mind as we look at these events of what happened in Ocoee in 1920 and this Election Day massacre, whereby nearly 60 African Americans would be killed by racist whites in Orange County. Ocoee, of course, is located in northwest Orange County, about 13 miles northwest of downtown Orlando. Another factor that would contribute to this Election Day violence, of course, was many troops, both Black and white troops, returning from World War I. And with the return of these troops, of course, were an expectation, particularly from African American troops, an expectation of a new racial order where they would demand more civil and human rights and respect afforded to them because of their bravery in being on display on the battlefield in Europe. A third factor that would influence and create an environment for this Election Day massacre, of course, was the Red Summer of 1919. It was called the Red Summer not because of a rise of communist sentiments, although that would become important as well as far as communism and the attitudes that communism promoted would be on the rise in this country. But it would be called the Red Summer because so much blood was shed throughout the summer of 1919 as many whites began to assault African Americans in various cities, well over 25 cities throughout the United States. And so much blood was shed. A Jacksonville native by the name of James Weldon Johnson would term this summer as the Red Summer of 1919. And so that would be a third important factor to keep in mind. A fourth factor, of course, would be the 19th Amendment, which would be approved in August of 1920, just 2 or 3 months before this election day massacre of November 3rd. This would become important because not only are women all over the country now able to vote in their first election that November, but more importantly, African-American women. Now, African-American women, of course, had played an instrumental role in the electoral process that dates back to 1865 or 1870, when African-American men secured the right to vote for themselves. Many African-American women played an important role in informing the community of the major issues that they saw fit and important that would impact the entire community, and thus influence African-American men on how to vote throughout the 1860s and 70s and the rest of the late 19th century. Early throughout the 20th century, this would continue. But now, because of what happened with the passage of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920, now African-American women would begin to register to vote in large numbers themselves. And this created not only a sense of excitement within the Black community throughout the country, as well as in Orange County in Central Florida, but it created an anxiety among those within the white community. Knowing because, of course, in those various districts throughout the state of Florida where African Americans were in the majority, that they could potentially sway elections. Historically, of course, African Americans during this period were overwhelmingly registered Republicans. However, the Republican Party was ineffective in the state of Florida because, of course, the Democrats, which were the party of the planter class, the ruling white elites, were in complete control since the Civil War, or since the Compromise of 1877, or what some historians have dubbed the capitulation of 1877, whereby it would allow the rise of white supremacy Democrats to gain political foothold throughout the 1870s and 1880s and well into the 20th century. And thus, many white Republicans began to engage and get out the vote campaigns and to register African Americans in that summer of 1920. And this created some sense of anxiety among many racist whites, particularly those who had been registered Democrats within Florida. And so these attitudes were no different there in Orange County, including the Ocoee. So much so that you had active chapters of the KKK that would parade not only that Saturday before the November 3rd massacre, but also the night before or the afternoon before. They would parade through the streets of downtown Orlando. Some estimates as high as 500 Klansmen paraded that Saturday, October 31st, but also the day before in Ocoee, in downtown Ocoee. Many KKK members had paraded throughout downtown Ocoee to intimidate and warn African Americans not to come out and vote the next day, which, by the way, would be another factor that would create this climate. And that factor, of course, was not only the various lynchings of the 19-teens, but the film Birth of a Nation, which would contribute to the rise of the Second Klan movement in 1917, 1918, including right there in Georgia, in Stone Mountain, Georgia. And so the rise of, you know, unabated and unnaked white supremacy would be contributed to this rise of this film, The Birth of a Nation, as well as the active chapters of the Klan throughout the entire nation, including in Florida. And so on the day of Election Day, November 3rd, 1920, Mose Norman, who was very good friends with July Perry, that I had mentioned at the beginning at the talk of this section, attempted to vote. He arrived, and unfortunately, he was denied. The claim was that he was not registered. And of course, he had paid his poll tax. He was, of course, clearly registered. He was one of the more affluent members of this African-American community on the north side of Ocoee, called Methodist Quarters. Ocoee at this time had a population of about 1,000 citizens. Almost half, about 495, were African-American. And the Black community in Ocoee was so large that you had two distinct sections of the city that had a predominantly Black community. The North Side or North Quarters, that was also called Methodist Quarters. And then the South Side of Ocoee was another large Black community called Baptist Quarters. When Mose Norman, who was well respected in the community because he was a large landowner, as a matter of fact, he was so affluent that he was one of the few Black members of the community that owned his own vehicle. And some would attribute that his display of this brand new vehicle would contribute to these attitudes that whites were jealous and wanted to get rid of this symbol of success. In other words, they saw Mose Norman as violating the racial etiquette of the day, whereby he was not overly humble or overly, ingratiating to whites. He unapologetically, of course, rode through the streets in his vehicle, and he showed up to the polls wanting to vote, and he was denied, and he immediately went and drove at that time and took over an hour to get to downtown Orlando in order to speak with Judge Cheney, which was a sympathetic white Republican who had encouraged Blacks to register to vote. Cheney, of course, himself was running for the state Senate, and he needed the Republican vote. He needed African Americans to vote in order for his victory to be ensured. Nevertheless, he gave the instructions or the advice for Mose Norman to go back to the polling booth in Ocoee and document who were the individuals that were denying him the vote. And in order to build the case against these individuals of the violation of his civil rights. And of course, this would unfortunately be the trigger, if you will. Upon arriving back to Ocoee, he attempted to vote again. Whites accosted him while he was in his vehicle, and while he was away from his vehicle, while his car was parked, and they saw that he had a gun in the back of the vehicle. What you see on your screen now is an example of the type of car that he had, a Columbia 6 vehicle. And upon seeing this gun, they began to assault him physically. He was able to get away in his car, although he was severely injured. And he ran, at least according to some reports, to his good friend, July Perry. As I mentioned before, they had moved from South Carolina 30 years earlier, and they had created a successful life for themselves in Ocoee. Upon members of the white community hearing this, they began to approach July Perry's home, and they began to demand for Mose Norman to come out. But unfortunately, Mose Norman had already left the home, and it was just simply July Perry and his wife and his daughter at the house. This group of whites began to demand for July Perry to exit his home, and he attempted to do so. However, when the whites began to grab Perry, his daughter, Caretha, grabbed her gun and placed the gun on the stomach of one of the white individuals. And this white individual attempted to pull the gun away. The gun went off, and this white individual was shot. And thus many whites began to retreat and began to shoot the home multiple times, including hitting July Perry and his daughter Caretha. Ultimately, those whites would leave in order to get reinforcements. July Perry and his wife and daughter Caretha Perry, his wife's name was Estelle. They would flee their home and hide in the fields near their home. Unfortunately, upon hundreds of whites returning, they would find July Perry severely injured, although his wife and daughter fled because July Perry insisted that they leave before the whites would return. And this is a photo here of July Perry. This new group of whites would take Perry and arrest him, and he would be severely injured. And his injuries were such where he would certainly die from those injuries because of the gun injuries he had received early. But nevertheless, whites would later arrive at the jail and demand his release. And overwhelmed, the sheriff could not stop the mob, and they unfortunately ultimately would hang him. They would lynch him, and his body would be displayed there on the corner, or not too far from Highway 50 and 441, or Orange Blossom Trail, not too far from the home, from Judge Cheney's home, in order to give the message for not only Republicans, but for African Americans, both in Ocoee and all over the county. If they dared engage to engage in the political process, they too would meet the same fate. Eventually, this mob of whites would return to the city of Ocoee and began to dismantle and destroy the north side of the city. Blacks fled the city, but not before nearly 60 being killed and murdered by the mob. Whites on the south side of town would be given an ultimatum to flee, to sell their property for pennies on the dollar, and many of them did. As a matter of fact, the city of Ocoee would become an all-white city. Records would show that one Black man would survive and live in the city. He was a former African captive who had been freed back in the 1860s, 1865. And the whites in the community put him in a home in downtown Orlando, thus making the city completely white after 1930, and would remain white well into the late 1970s. For many African Americans who did survive, their descendants would make the case for the city and the state to give them some type of reparations, if you will. Unfortunately, that was not forthcoming, although those efforts continue to this very day. I've gone over my time, so I'll end on that note. But I'll continue just briefly here with these various slides that you see. There would be a historical marker place in Ocoee where various dignitaries, including, as you see there, Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings and Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Institute was there as well, Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer, and State Attorney Aramis Ayala as well, as you see there on the top left. Perry's descendants, you see at the bottom left of your screen, would also be there. So thank you for your time. Thank you. I'll give it right back to you, Dr. Jackson. I'll stop the screen share now.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Guzman, for a very informative presentation. And we look forward to engaging with you in Q&A at the end of the session. But without further ado, we have the next presenter, Dr. Tameka Hobbs, who will present next and close us out before Q&A. Dr. Hobbs.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Good evening, everyone. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to be here with you. I would like to thank Steve Seibert, Keith Simmons, and everyone with the Florida Humanities Council for the invitation and the opportunity to be a part of this program. I will echo what I heard Steve say at the top of this presentation, and that is that I firmly believe that the humanities have a role to play in helping all of us to understand and demystify the current state of race relations here in 2020. And I'm very pleased that they have taken up that mantle, and again, to be a part of the presentation this evening. I would like to do a few things this evening, 3 specifically. The first thing I will do is to reinforce the timeline that my colleagues, Dr. Jackson and Dr. Guzman, have laid out for us this evening. But secondly, I'm going to do that through the lens of systemic oppression. I believe that if we are really and truly to be able to thread the needle from the past to the present, we have to look at systems and structures that remain in place despite change over time. And I think when we talk about anti-Black violence specifically, we will see that there is quite a deadly and unfortunate continuum that exists not only in the United States history, but in Florida history. And then lastly, I'd like to conclude with a brief discussion on the importance of lynching and memory here in the state of Florida. But to go back and to really just recap what we've seen so far, when we look at what has happened with the Black population in Florida after emancipation, we see that there have been various challenges various hurdles that have been put in place that limited the ability of African Americans to achieve and fulfill the promises of freedom. African Americans, both in the United States and the South, but in particular in Florida, had to contend with behaviors and policies on the part of whites that were the antithesis of freedom, liberty, and justice. Black Floridians found themselves enmeshed in interlocking systems of oppression that we would describe today as both institutional and systemic. The overarching motivation of whites throughout the region was the control and commodification of Black bodies. The window of opportunity presented with emancipation in 1865 began to crumble by the 1870s. White Democrats in the state were firm and determined in their quest to reduce and ultimately eliminate African Americans as social equals and political competitors, while at the same time maintaining their ability to exploit Black labor. And you heard my colleague, Dr. Guzman, give you some of that very bloody history from Jackson County. Some historians have referred to it as the Jackson County War. Unfortunately, that moniker is well-deserved, but it helps to illustrate the lengths to which the white power structure or the whites at that time would go to reinstate their dominance in that region specifically, but throughout the state. During that period, for about 2 decades in the years after we talk about the decline of Reconstruction, white leaders in the state sought to curtail Black political power. Florida's 1889 Constitution made a significant dent in the ability of African Americans to participate in the political process in Florida. That Constitution included a poll tax and required high bonds for people seeking elected office, both of which proved to be economic deterrents to voters and Blacks who would run for office. Knowing that many African Americans still struggled with illiteracy after their years in bondage, the Florida legislature instituted measures that took advantage of that fact by implementing things such as multiple voting boxes and allowing local voter registrars broad powers to determine who would be able to exercise the right to vote in their jurisdictions. Not satisfied with disenfranchisement, the Florida legislature took additional steps to reinforce the marginalized position of Black people in the state by instituting forced labor regimes such as a massive convict leasing system. The state of Florida created the State Convict Road Force and the State Prison Farm in 1917, of which over 80% of the folks, the prisoners there, were African Americans. It ended up creating an $18 million business that was run by the state and was comparable to private industry. That system exploited and abused Black convict laborers and forced them to build roads that facilitated the flow of tourists into the state and the money coming into the state. Beyond that, white legislatures also created other economic controls outside of the convict leasing system. They passed things known as after dark laws that sought to eliminate the possibilities of Blacks creating their own underground economy. Like anti-enticement laws, prevented white landowners from poaching laborers from one farm to another, and later sought to inhibit the ability of Northern industry in its quest to take advantage of the vast pools of Black laborers in the South. It was also during this time period that Jim Crow laws took shape in Florida. Segregation was mandated not only for public transportation, religious meetings, public meetings, but for schools as well. There was a ban on interracial marriage. Blacks would be singled out for special punishments such as whipping and capital punishment for assaults, especially against white women. It's important to recognize that while the legal code was one thing, the enforcement and maintenance of this legal and social order rested firmly in the hands of the state's law enforcement structure. They enforced the vagrancy laws, they rounded up the cheap labor, they enforced segregation laws. It was this network of sheriffs, police, deputies, and constables, along with judges and prosecutors, who conspired together to maintain the social and economic order of Jim Crow on a daily basis in communities throughout the state. I refer to this as a triad of oppression. On the one finger, you have economic motivation. On the second, you have legislative innovation. And then lastly, you have local implementation by law enforcement. Taken together, these conditions can best be, these conditions at best circumscribe the lives of generations of Black Floridians. At worst, they resulted in abuse and death. And when we take all of these together, lynching violence stands at the pinnacle of this pyramid of racial injustice. All of these factors, disenfranchisement, Jim Crow, and the desire to take control and maintain control over Black labor, contributed to the conditions that allowed for the proliferation of racial violence in Florida. The extralegal murder of African Americans in the late 19th and 20th century reinforced the legal subjugation that Blacks experienced in the state. And when we talk about lynching, I want to be clear about the systemic nature of it, because we know that traditionally under our laws, and we pride ourselves of being a nation of laws, that when a crime is committed, especially something as heinous as a murder, that there is an arrest, there is an investigation, there's prosecution, there's a trial, there's a judge, there's a jury, there's a right to appeal. But when we talk about extra-legal violence, the type of violence that takes place outside of the law, it is a community-sanctioned extra-legal process resulting in the open murder of individuals. And it's important for us to understand, again, although we pride ourselves as being a nation of laws, this Holocaust of sorts was perpetrated here in our country, in our nation, and more importantly, here in the state of Florida. When Dr. Jackson was speaking earlier, he presented some of these facts and statistics about lynching. I think it's important enough to repeat here. As you can see, between the years of 1882, when we really began to start tracking and tracing lynching incidents all the way up until 1951, we estimate that as many as 4,730 lynchings were recorded on whole in the United States. The majority of them took place in the states of the former Confederacy, and the majority of the victims, 52.3% or 73% of them were Black. Now, when we get more granular and look at what was happening in the state of Florida, you will see that we had a couple of different numbers that were reported. If we look back at some of the earlier numbers, we stood at 282 of these incidents. Some of the work that's been done by the Equal Justice Initiative more recently have increased that number to 313. But whether you use the lower number or the higher number, one thing is consistent, and that is that Florida had the highest rate of lynching per capita of any Southern state. If we were to state that another way, African Americans living in the state of Florida during the lynching era had the highest likelihood of being lynched of any Black people in the United States and in America. I go back to Dr. Jackson's opening statement and his point about our continued use of this narrative of Florida's exceptionalism, that Florida is somehow more liberal, that some of the things that we associate with the Deep South didn't happen here. That per capita number reinforces the fact that Florida was very much in line with many of the other states in the South. If we want to kind of go through a timeline and chronology and look at how this played out, this lack of protection of citizens here in the state of Florida, it is a gruesome and bloody tale, some of which you've heard already. But I'll again reinforce that chronology and fill in a few gaps that remain in our conversation. We can talk about Newberry in Alachua County. After Boise Long was accused of stealing hogs there in Alachua County in August of 1960, pursuit of him ultimately resulted in the lynching of 6 Black people, brothers Jim and Bert Dennis, Jim's wife, Mary Dennis, her sister and wife of Boise Long, Stella Young, who was pregnant, Andrew McHenry, and Josh Baskins, who was a local minister. It was a mass lynching that took place in Alachua County in 1916. Again, reinforcing the fact that women were not exempt from this treatment, and even women with such a delicate condition as pregnancy were not spared the noose. You heard Dr. Guzman speak at length about the violence that took place in Ocoee. As he said, we will be observing the centennial of that massacre on next Monday, November the 2nd. Two very important things to recognize here that I will reinforce. Number one, all of this stemmed from electoral violence. It was the persistence of Mose Norman and July Perry and their determination to exercise their rights to vote as citizens here in the state of Florida that sparked this violence. The other piece that I think is quite significant and was alluded to by Dr. Jackson is the 1920 election was of great significance because it would have been the first time that women, but specifically Black women, would have been eligible to vote. And this inspired a wave of anxiety among the white population that manifested with a statewide, region-wide campaign on the part of the KKK to discourage and intimidate African Americans from exercising their right to vote. And when you look at the specific concern, it was specifically the ability of Black women to vote that they were most concerned about. And that's important to remember when we think about Ocoee and when we think about the pending election. And then when we recognize even today that African Americans, women make up one of the most dedicated block of Democratic voters in this country. Fast forward a few years later, just 3, we can talk about, you heard Dr. Jackson talk about the violence that took place in Rosewood in 1923. A false accusation by Fannie Taylor that she had been raped resulted in the decimation of a second majority Black community in the state of Florida, wherein in Ocoee, we know that that community had been a population of about 500. We estimate that in the case of Rosewood, that potentially as many as 700 people had to flee that area. So again, not just these individualized instances of violence, but the elimination, the destruction of entire Black communities. Fast forward a bit, and when we go back to the Panhandle, we can talk about, you heard Dr. Jackson mention the lynching of Claude Neal there in Marianna in 1934, again accused of lynching, accused of raping a white woman. What's significant about this is that there were broadcasts of the pending lynching as they pursued Claude Neal, as the law enforcement officers did make an attempt to protect his life. But there was enough lead time that if they had been inclined, they would have been able to protect his life. That did not happen for Claude Neal. Thousands of people from the tri-state area, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, descended on a Kennedy farm to witness the lynching of Claude Neal, which was brutal, which was gruesome, which goes down in history as one of the last mass lynchings to take place in the United States, and that happened here in the state of Florida. When we talk about Florida's exceptionalism, it's also interesting to point out that sometimes South Florida is not exactly seen as a participant in many of these instances of racial violence and lynching. The example of Reuben Stacy flies in the face of that. Reuben Stacy was accused of frightening a white woman and was lynched in Fort Lauderdale on July the 19th of 1935, with not only the open awareness of law enforcement in the region, but as you can see from this photograph, without any expectation that anyone would be called to account for the murder of this man. And when we talk about the importance of lynching phenomena as evidence of the mindset of this particular period in time, it is indeed very telling and very important. We leave the decade of the 1930s and fast forward to the 1940s. It is significant to acknowledge that at the same time and during some of the same years that the United States is going to be involved in fighting a war against the Axis power, a war for democracy in the world, that we still see continued instances of lynching taking place in the United States, but specifically in the state of Florida. And I write about these lynchings in my book, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida. And it was a great privilege for me to be able to tell the details of the murders of these 4 individuals, 3 of them Black men, 1 of them a Black boy, who were murdered between the years of 1941 and 1945. Arthur Williams, who was killed in Quincy, up in Gadsden County in 1941. I believe he was falsely accused of the attempted rape of a 12-year-old girl. But he was kidnapped from jail, a poorly secured jail, taken out and killed. Even though he survived the first attempt on his life, he was not inadequately protected, taken out and killed. The attempt on his life was successful the second time. He is pictured at the top right on the slide that you see in front of you. The next lynching that we see taking place was that of Celis Harrison, again in Marianna. This took place in 1943. And Marianna, if it sounds familiar, we were just talking about it a few slides ago. That community, because of the spotlight, the national spotlight that descended on them, tried to go a different direction when it came to their attention that Celis Harrison, I believe, was falsely accused of the murder of Johnny Mayo. They attempted to pursue what we call in the field a legal lynching. They put on a sham trial with the expectation that Celis Harrison would be found guilty and executed, but for the intervention of a skilled white attorney who came to his defense, that may have happened. Once they realized that the legal lynching would not work, the citizens known to us of Jackson County resorted to the old practice of a hanging, of a kidnapping and an execution. And Celis Harrison met his end that way. The following year, in 1944, in Live Oak, Florida, where I'm from, a 15-year-old boy by the name of Willie James Howard was forced to jump into the Swanee River, where he drowned by 3 white men who forced his father to watch. We don't know as much about Willie James Howard as we ought to. We are much more familiar with the case of Emmett Till that happens 11 years later. But to go back to Dr. Jackson's comparison between what happens in the state of Florida and what happens in some of these more better known cases of violence and protests throughout the South, we should know the name of Willie James Howard. The last incident that I write about in the 1940s is the lynching of Jesse James Payne of Madison County. He was, again, falsely accused of the attempted rape of a 5-year-old girl. He was accused by that girl's father because the 2 men had a dispute. Ultimately, we see the lynching of Jesse James Payne. There is no justice in this case. His family is dispersed. Members of the family were disconnected for years. I write about that in my book. But all of these taken together leave us, number one, with the knowledge of the painful continuation of lynching violence in the state of Florida, as I pointed out, even during the years of World War II. And beyond that, the fact that there would be no justice in these cases for these families or for the decedents. And that's something that we all have to contend with. And when we talk about the international implications of all of this, I think it's really important to point that out. Myself and other scholars, Mary Duziak of note, point out, and I'll quote her here, the focus of the American foreign policy during this time was to promote democracy and to contain communism. But the international focus on US race problems meant that the image of American democracy was tarnished, and lynching did tarnish America's reputation abroad, and ultimately did compel some action on the part of the federal government, but not enough to really render justice in these situations. At this point, as I move into my conclusion, I'd just like to make a point about what we can learn and what we should understand from the examples of lynching from our past in the state of Florida and what it leaves with us now. William Faulkner said that the past is never dead. It's not even the past. James Baldwin kind of struck on note too, similar to this, when he said, and I quote, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." Our nation, our state, our communities have struggled to grapple with the legacy of lynching. The weight of the twin travesties of brutality and injustice. Our nation has evaded its responsibility and avoided accountability. In short, many have not wanted to remember, but I maintain that this is exactly what we must do, that we can't continue to repress these memories. We have to begin to engage in conversations about them, about the historical imbalances in power and the continuing inequity that we see in our nation, about the history of institutional and systemic racism and their modern manifestations, about historical injustices and their legacies. Over the past few years, I've been impressed and encouraged by the work of Brian Stevenson, and specifically the opening in April of 2018 of both the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And there's a quote that was written, a line that was written by Brian Stevenson that I think really speaks to the meaning of their efforts, and for all of us who endeavor to make sure that the memory of these lynchings are not forgotten. And I'll read it here. This shadow, and he refers to the shadow as the legacy of racial injustice. The shadow cannot be lifted until we shine the light of truth on the destructive violence that shaped our nation, traumatized people of color, and that compromise our commitment to the rule of law and to equal justice. A history of racial injustice must be acknowledged, and mass atrocities and abuse must be recognized and remembered before a society can recover from mass violence. Public commemoration plays a significant role in prompting community-wide reconciliation. I believe, as he does, that publicly confronting the truth about our history is the first step towards recovery and reconciliation. By and large, in this nation and in the state, African Americans have been forced to carry the burdens of these painful memories alone. But we must look, all of us together. We need to exhume these stories, interrogate this history, work to reconcile, work to heal, and learn the lessons. And more importantly, vow not to repeat the misdeeds. The history of Florida is replete with examples of tragedies that unfold when justice is weighted in favor of those with privilege and power, and when the wheels of justice turn too slowly or fail to turn at all. If you understand the history of lynching and racial violence in Florida specifically and the nation writ large, you can better understand the Black Lives Matter movement and the many social justice movements that have been burgeoning this year across our communities, our state, and our nation. And that's a discussion I hope that we can have as we wrap up. As I conclude, I'd like to call the name again of someone who's already been mentioned this evening. It's the name of Harry Tyson Moore. He's a native of Suwannee County, as am I. He is a graduate and valedictorian of the class of 1925 of Florida Memorial College when it was located in Live Oak, Florida, but an institution for which now I work. Harry T. Moore, as has been said, was renowned for not only being a dedicated educator and organizer. He was the first president of the state conference of the NAACP. He was one of the co-founders of the Progressive Voters League. And before his tragic assassination in 1951, he led to the registration of 110,000 African-American voters in this state. And it's important that we remember him as we head into this election, as we are in the midst of this election season and head to Election Day next Tuesday. But I'd like to leave you with a couple of quotes from Harry T. Moore that speak to the importance of our need to continue to work and advocate for social justice, especially as it concerns civic engagement. We bemoan the inequalities in educational opportunity, the segregation, the police brutality, lynching, and other evils that are heaped upon Negro citizens. But so few of us are willing to take positive action for the alleviations of these conditions. If we are to receive proper respect from those who govern us, we must exercise some voice in their election. And then lastly, another quote from Harry T. Moore, in the year of his death, the month of his assassination: "Freedom is not free. If we want our complete emancipation, we must be willing to pay the price." Again, I thank you for your time this evening, and I look forward to engaging with you in the question and answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Hobbs, for a wonderful presentation, very informative, and Dr. Guzman as well. And we are excited now to entertain questions. So we're going to ask Mr. Keith Simmons to come on and manage the questions in the chat. And while you're doing that, Keith, I did not share with the audience a couple of books that I had at the end of my slide presentation. So I am going to bring those up just so the audience can see them. And then I'll close the shared screen out afterwards. So but okay, so those are some books on the landmark studies on the Claude Neal lynching, Rosewood Massacre, and then the Groveland case and civil rights movement in Tallahassee, the bus boycott. So I wanted to make those available to the audience to see. All right. Mr. Simmons.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for providing those books. And we'll provide them again, along with the books that some of our other presenters have talked about in their presentations. We'll provide those also to all of the members of our audience. We want to go ahead and try to do as much of a Q&A as we can. I think there's a lot of really interesting things to talk about and to dive into in specifics from some of these presentations. And one of the things that I think I'd like to talk about, and I don't know if there's really anyone who would be best suited to talk about this, but it's more of a philosophical way of approaching this history. I think all three of you in your presentations, you talked about certain events in Florida's history that can be particularly brutal. Dr. Jackson, you mentioned it, for example, at the beginning of your presentation, that there are going to be instances that could be a little bit graphic. And so I wonder if someone could, or perhaps all three of you, comment on including those details. And it's perhaps sort of trying to bear witness to this history by not necessarily editing out those details, but including them into this historical record. I mean, how do you decide what ultimately should be included, what might be excluded? How do you negotiate that difficulty?
I'll take a stab at that. I will say that that's where we get into trouble, is the editing and the tiptoeing. And it all amounts to a continuation of the silence, especially as it concerns the more brutal parts of the Black experience here. But I'm always struck that we don't have the same level of reticence when it comes to discussing the Holocaust. We fully expose students at very young ages, very tender ages, to all of the terrible elements of that experience. But when it comes to this homegrown Holocaust, and I'll use that term intentionally, we somehow can't muster the strength to engage around that. I find that troubling. I think you do have to do it with some level of sensitivity, but we all pay a price when people do not understand this history. Part of the reason that, in my opinion, the Black Lives Matter movement is so misunderstood and so misinterpreted is because of my experience. What I've seen in my classrooms, what I've seen in my presentation, is that most Americans lack a fundamental understanding of the tragic history of lynching and racial violence in its true scope. If you don't understand that history, you cannot understand the experience and the memory, if I go back to the term that I used during my presentation, that lives with us in our culture and in our communities. We know through these examples, I write about them, I research them, that law enforcement officers are capable of participating and perpetuating brutality. We've seen that. Our history teaches us that. Why, though, are we disbelieved when we acknowledge that happening in the current system? Now we have video, and so it's nearly undeniable. But I think that if we had a more robust discussion in our public education system, in our communities, I do think that it's incumbent upon members in the African American community to take ownership of the need to tell these stories and make sure at least that our children are fully aware in order to kind of move to a position where there's more full disclosure.
Is there anyone else that'd like to respond to that question?
Sure. I'll just add that Dr. Hobbs and I have served on the Florida statewide African American History Task Force. And so we both know that there are only a handful, no more than a dozen counties throughout the state that actually adhere to the state mandate and law that requires the teaching of African American history be integrated into the curriculum out of the 67 counties. And so what is that resistance? Part of it, I think, complements the answer that she just gave us, which is the resistance, at least from public officials in this instance, is from many teachers. One, do not have the professional development dollars that are needed to give them the skill sets and history that's needed in order for them to then turn and teach it. Second, is an unwillingness, even when you do allocate the dollars to train teachers for professional development to integrate African-American history into the curriculum. The resistance is that most teachers in the state do not want to teach African-American history because of what it implies, because of what it entails. As Dr. Hobbs mentioned, most people are more comfortable with the Jewish Holocaust and Jewish history. And that history is extremely important and should be taught and is required to be taught in the state. However, equally important is African-American history.
And I would just add to that I think part of the challenge that we have is that there is, to echo the sentiments of my colleagues, there is a gap between the actual learning of educators and their willingness and knowledge base to transmit information to the people that they are teaching. So Carter G. Woodson and his magnum opus, The Miseducation of the Negro, published in 1933, made the point that, you know, it's possible to matriculate through the K-12 system and go to college and not really get any exposure about African and African-American history. And that's not only for white teachers, that's also for Black teachers as well. So what Dr. Guzman is talking about in terms of the task force is we in fact had workshops to bring teachers in from across the state to train them, but it's not enough to try and catch up to people. It should be a part of the curriculum as they matriculate. And it should not be by happenstance that if the educators attended a particular school, then they will have this knowledge. It should be really built in to the curriculum. And I think that, you know, the main answer to your question, Keith, and some things have to, as Dr. Hobbs said, we have to be sensitive, of course, in particular as it relates to age groupings of young people, but it's an imperative of truth. And so we have to be truthful. I once read that a wise man seeks the truth, a coward runs and hides from truth, and a fool argues against truth in order to make truth a lie.
That's certainly a fantastic way, I think, to put that. And what I would like to do, I think, now is try to go into a little bit more detail and getting into some more specifics from some of these presentations. And so for this next question, I'm not sure who might be best positioned to answer it, but several times we use terms like mob and lynching in these presentations. Is there really a difference, or should there be a difference in terms of that terminology? Does a mob sort of mean one thing as opposed to a lynching meaning something else? And I think one of our participants, who's a high school teacher, asked this question, and I think she wants to be able to use the appropriate terms in talking to her students.
If I could take a attempt to answer that, I defer to the definitions that were given by Fitzhugh Brundage in his book, Lynching in the New South. And he does something that is, I think, quite important in helping us to define lynching. Number one, lynching is extralegal murder. It doesn't matter. People usually instantly associate the noose or, you know, this kind of very traditional way of thinking about it, but it doesn't matter the method of death. If there is a dead body, if it was done in service to race or tradition, if it was executed, and then we can quibble about the number, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, that constitutes a lynching. There are different types of lynchings that take place. We refer to mob lynchings as ones where there are dozens, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who come to participate. Sometimes we call them spectacle lynchings for that reason. Again, kind of this this festive air, if you can imagine, of people coming out to participate in this ritualized form of violence that has so much a part of Southern culture. The lynchings that I focus on, which take place later in the kind of trajectory of the lynching violence period or lynching era, are described by Fitzhugh Brundage as private mobs. They're secretive. They're much more concerned with being discovered. If you drill down into that chronology, the Claude Neal lynching of 1934 made national and international news. The federal government began to make motions, haltingly, of course, that they were going to investigate and look into it. And so there was a change of approach, if you will, on the part of these white Southerners to begin to at least hide a little bit. They're not making their open plans, they're not advertising broadly, but it's a small group of folks coming together to plan and carry out these incidents. So to answer the question, lynching is the extra legal murder. The form is very different. And we use the term mob or spectacle to describe the number of people who were there. Dr. Jackson, I know that you lectured about that part too. I don't know if you have anything to add. He's my senior, so I always defer.
No, I think you said it very well, Dr. Hobbs. Great job.
And there's something else that you just mentioned, Dr. Hobbs, that I think is really interesting. You talked about Claude Neal and the fact that his lynching made not only national news, but international news. And I think we're talking about, when we talk about Reconstruction and Jim Crow, we're talking about a period in American history where journalism kind of takes this a little bit more of a modern look. Certainly when we have incidents happen in the present, video is very likely to accompany a news story. But certainly we have pictures and things like that. And, in some of the video or some of the pictures that were shown during our presentations. And so I wonder if anyone could respond to really what is this role of journalism what is the role of journalism in documenting a lot of these cases? I know Ida B. Wells and certainly her work as a part of documenting a lot of this. And is there a role in particular for Black newspapers or Black journalists during this period?
Well, during segregation, certainly there were separate roles, right? So as I kind of shared in my presentation, the newspapers, just as much as the law enforcement officers, the newspaper men, they were participants in these lynchings that took place. And they actually, the newspaper editors, inflamed the situations, they embellished the stories, they riled up the people. And not only that, as part of the memorabilia that was collected, people created postcards. They took those photographs and they sent them from the South all throughout the country to let people know what was taking place in the South. And so it was clear that the perspective of a lot of the Southern newspaper editors and journalists was one to not report information. And I guess another point that we see here is that if they were in earnest trying to report the stories, you would not have so many coroner's reports that said that people died at the hands of persons unknown, because those individuals were present. And if they wanted to report who actually conducted and were engaged in the lynchings, they had the ability to do so, but they chose not to. And so during the period of segregation, it was a necessity for Black journalists to tell the perspective of what happened from the Black perspective, right? And in many instances, the perspective of the victim. So when we talk about the lynching of Claude Neal, the reason why we have so many details, it took a newspaper, an investigator from the NAACP, a man by the name of Howard Kester, who was light enough to pass for white, to come down and actually interview and talk to the people who were engaged with the mob. And they accurately told him what they did because they thought they were talking to a white guy. And then he went back and reported the information. And so that was the role of journalists, not just Ida B. Wells, but a number of Black journalists put their lives on the line to try and investigate these situations. And so there will be a larger movement to work to try and curtail the kind of violence that was heaped upon African Americans in the South. So I think that there are separate roles. And if we look at it today, I think we're in a different space in terms of that. I think that journalists should have a responsibility to report truth and not propaganda. And I think that's one of the confusing aspects for many people who live in this country. You know, there's one leader of prominent person in the United States, said at one point that he loved the undereducated. And one of the reasons that he said that was because it's easier to manipulate and control the thinking of those people as opposed to critical thinkers. So I think we need a more balanced kind of reporting. I think that the video cameras and all of that people have access to has made the people more honest today. And a lot of the violence that we see taking place in the country even today is not new. It's just really video. That's what's new about it, that people have cameras on their phones and they can video it. But this stuff has been going on for a long time, and it's time for it to stop.
If I may, just briefly, I'd like to add on to that. The name of Ida B. Wells has been called here. I would like to echo that. She's a personal shero of mine. Amazing to think her boldness and the way that she wielded her pen in defense of her people and specifically Black men. I also, when I think about her, think about the power of international, speaking truth to power on an international basis. That was part of her strategy when she took a tour to England to, let, America's mother country, so to speak, to shame America on this international stage for the distance and the cognitive dissonance between what they claim to be and what they actually did. In my book, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, I make good use of the publications, the articles that were written by members of the Black press. They were masters of rhetoric when it came to, during the 1930s and 40s, pointing out the difference between what America claimed to be abroad and its practices of discrimination at home. Actually, the image on the cover of my book was a cartoon that was originally published in the Pittsburgh Courier and the Amsterdam News shortly after the lynching of Celis Harrison in Florida. It's a Black man run through on the end of a bayonet. And on the edge of the bayonet, it says Southern Fascist. And it says, the caption of the title of the cartoon is Hitler is Here. And I think that was absolutely profound. And the way that these Black journalists and Black cartoonists attempted to educate and indict people in America, people in the South, for the inconsistencies in their practice. And so I, for one, in the course of my research, just came to deeply appreciate the efforts of those Black journalists from that period.
So Keith, if I could just add a compliment Dr. Hobbs' point, in the comment section or in the chat, I inserted a quote from Ida B. Wells, which states that Winchester rifles should have a place of honor in every Black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give, unquote. And I found that quote so appropriate, particularly for Dr. Hobbs' conversation and my own conversation this evening, because when you look at what happened to July Perry, it was really his daughter that came to his defense, and she's, Caritha, she's left out of many interpretations and writings of what happened in Ocoee, in the Ocoee Massacre in November of 1920. I think that it somewhat limits the role and importance of Black women in these liberation struggles. And then the last point I like to make is to compliment not only your question, but also Dr. Jackson's point that these disparities in interpretations of journalists continue to this very day. So when you look at, for example, the murder of Martin Lee Anderson in 2006, or the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, and Jordan Davis in Jacksonville, Florida in 2012 as well. In all three examples, you see the media's interpretation and demonizing these young Black boys, turning them into young Black men, and then in turn, turning them into criminals first. And so despite a highly educated journalist class, these misgivings continue, these misinterpretations continue, this bias continues against the African-American community, particularly young Black boys.
Can I add, though, by contrast, to further your point, what we saw with Kyle Whittingham in Kenosha, who traveled across state lines with an automatic weapon, who killed 2 protesters, and is consistently described in the media as a child, as a kid. He's 17. But if you take a look at the cases you mentioned, we all know the case of Tamir Rice, Jordan Davis, the list goes on, unfortunately. And Philip Ativa Goff, who's with, I think, John Jay College now, he researches this and talks about the loss of innocence. I forget the name of the article specifically, but it talks about the perceptions among common people, jury members, and law enforcement that hold young Black and brown boys to be more culpable and more criminal than their white counterparts. That's a kind of a social psychology study that he does, but the evidence is there once we begin to poke behind the surface.
And I think this is sort of approaching, it's clearly underlying the legacy that this period of history has had on our history. And we're going to get into this more in our next our next panel and the panel after that, in terms of talking about more of this modern civil rights movement. And what I'd like to capture, I think, sort of as our last question of the evening is, and I want to go to Dr. Jackson last because of a quote that you brought up about Dr. Franklin. But it's this question of where do we go from here, and certainly wanting to capture all of your perspectives, on this question. We talked about this need to change some of the things that go on in curriculum, some of the ways that we have perhaps media perceptions. Is there anything else that we probably need to consider in terms of dealing with this particular period of history and potentially making progress as a state and as a country?
Well, I would just say that, in addition to working through the school system at the university level and in the K-12 system, I want to commend the board of the Florida Humanities Council and organizations like this for actually reaching out to individuals in the community. There are a lot of people we take for granted that, you can reach the masses of people through the university system. But most people in the United States don't go to college, right? And so by having different conversations and actually taking the academy outside of the classroom space to better inform the public will lead to a better understanding. And as Dr. Hobbs stated earlier, one of the things I was fascinated with when I started studying history was that I learned about the greatness of Africa and the royalty that existed in Africa, and then African Americans being enslaved in the United States. And then after the end of slavery and Reconstruction, really, the next thing you hear about is Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's like 100 years of history almost that's missing. And I became intrigued by that. I'm like, why do we never talk about this information, right? And so we have to actually address the information that's available. Knowledge is power and knowledge is transformational. But without that knowledge, then you can control the actions of people. One of my professors used to define propaganda is controlling one's actions by controlling their minds. And so if people don't have anything inside of their minds, if they don't have the information, it's easier to control those people. So I think we have to do a better job in not only promulgating knowledge and information in the educational setting, but we have to be willing to use forums and organizations like the Florida Humanities Council to take that information to the public. And that will precipitate a whole nother level of discussion. So I will hope we are recording these sessions and they are going to be circulated all over the state and perhaps throughout the country as well. And there's a lot of interest because there are over 200 people who signed on earlier to listen to what we had to say.
I'd like to echo a lot of what Dr. Jackson has said. And I want to again acknowledge the Florida Humanities Council for their commitment in bringing these stories into this virtual environment. Despite the pandemic, I think that it's an excellent opportunity to bring us together all across the state and using these video conferencing platforms to continue to do the work. And that's really, really important. To Dr. Jackson's point about the kind of the dearth of information, I'm reminded of a study that was done by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they call it the 9 words. The 9 words that most people know about Black American history are Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and I Have a Dream. And that kind of encapsulates what our children are taught. I do think that things that are in place are incredibly necessary. Dr. Guzman mentioned the Florida African American History Task Force. They do a yeoman's job of keeping that flame alive, of training teachers across the state. But we have to continue to work to full integration. How I even got on this path was my Black history class at Florida A&M University as an undergraduate. I was a business major, but I was so intrigued by what I heard, but also outraged by the fact that I had not heard it until then, that I thought that I wanted to be a part of the change. I worked with Dr. Guzman then as undergraduates in the Black Archives Research Center on that campus. And for me, public history, museums, exhibitions, became a part of the way that I thought that people could be exposed to this history. I would like to challenge us. The longer that I do this, the more that I recognize is that if we are waiting for the public school systems across this country and in this state to do the work that we need to do for our children, I think that we are mistaken. I do believe firmly in historically Black colleges as the bastions of our culture and our history. I think we have a role to play along with Black churches in helping to expand the offerings and teachings around history and culture in the state. That is work that we can partner with the Florida Humanities Council to do. But I think we have to be more aggressive and more creative and take ownership of the need to embed within our youth this information.
So Keith, if I may, couple quick points. Florida currently has well over 20 million people. Most of those individuals are recent arrivals in the sense of in the past 20 to 30 years. And because of that, they may not know this history of the state. And this is a history that's extremely uncomfortable and extremely traumatic. But I would still argue that it's necessary, even for the newcomers, to not only learn about this history, but to embrace this history and take full responsibility of this history. In other words, too often newcomers would argue that, well, that has nothing to do with me. I was not part of this history. I did not contribute to this violence or discrimination or racism or oppression. However, I would argue that once you have committed to moving to a state, for example, if you're moving from New York to Florida, as so many snowbirds do every winter, or if you've committed to come to the Florida from another country, that with that, you also have adopted that state's history as well, or that nation's history as well. Why? Because many of the events that we described today all happened under the guise and authority and approval and sanction of the state government. And thus it makes the state culpable, including its current citizens. And lastly, just as a point and compliment, Dr. Hobbs mentioning Florida A&M, it doesn't escape all 200, 300 people that are listening in right now. I'm sure it doesn't escape them though, the fact that we're all graduates of the #1 institution in the country, Florida A&M University, which produced these great scholars. I'm very humbled to just be on the panel with these two individuals. But I think that when you look at this period of history that we're studying, and I'm sorry, Keith, you too are a graduate of Florida A&M. So all 4 of us are graduates. That this period of history reflect that Black lawmakers, African Americans during the Reconstruction period, including the Gibbs brothers, Jonathan Gibbs in particular, had the wherewithal and the foresight to establish the only public HBCU the state has ever had, Florida A&M University, in 1887, October 1887. And so it was extremely important And it's not a coincidence that FAMU is created or established out of this period. Thank you again.
I think that's absolutely true. When you talk about really the importance of FAMU, just like Dr. Hobbs, on a quick personal note, I started off as a business major as well. And then after meeting Dr. Jackson, I decided to switch to be a history major. And I had the absolute pleasure of really learning from a range of scholars at my time at FAMU. And so I think this conversation tonight has really been an example of the kinds of conversations and the kinds of history that we talked about really all the time at FAMU. And so we're really happy that everyone that has participated tonight has had an opportunity to get a small sample of what those conversations and what that history is like. We have another equally dynamic panel lined up for Monday, November 2nd at 5. It's entitled I Am a Man, and it focuses on the civil rights movement in Florida. You'll receive some information about that along with an email for a survey. Again, we'd really appreciate you taking the time, filling it out. Let us know how we did this evening. Let us know how we can improve in the future. We're going to work as hard as we can to get this recording up, to get it available, as Dr. Jackson said, so it can circulate broadly. So we're going to provide an update as soon as that is available. But again, I appreciate everyone sort of hanging in there this evening and participating with us. And we hope to see you all again soon. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. Great job, team.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
you all.
Thank you.